Hi, I'm Cody Anderson, one of the pastors at Parker United Methodist Church. We are continuing our sermon series on the book of Genesis, and on Sunday we looked at the story of Abram and Sarai. Abram and Sarai, who are old in their years, and God brings to them a promise of a future that is beyond their grasp. A promise of a future that is hard for them to understand. A promise of a place to go that will be a land for them. And a promise of a child that will bring heirs upon heirs upon heirs for them. Now, this was a really hard thing for them to understand. A really hard thing for them to believe in. One, because they were older. And because maybe they'd given up. Maybe they had given up on trusting that God would be there with them, or maybe they'd given up that that promise would be for them. The thing that they had prayed for so long, they had just kind of given up on, that maybe God wasn't going to answer their prayers. And yet God was listening. God was present. And it took some time for them to be able to trust God's voice, right? There were mistakes that were made, huge mistakes that affected the lives of countless generations. But also, God remained faithful. And once they had experienced that faithfulness, their names were changed to Abraham and Sarah. I've been reflecting a lot on the lives of Abraham and Sarah and how that looks in our life today. Because if you're like me, there have been times where you have prayed and you have felt like your prayers have gone unanswered. You've prayed and you've prayed and you've prayed, and you felt like God didn't hear you. And if you've been like me, sometimes the path before me, has felt hard to trust in. I didn't know where I was going, and so to put one foot in front of the other was the only faithfulness that I could do. And it hasn't been until after that time had passed that I could look back and see how God had been faithful, how God had been with me that whole time, even when I thought God's voice was silent, even when I felt like God didn't hear me or wasn't going to answer my prayers. I can look back and I can see God's hand, God's faithfulness with me along the journey. What about you? Where have you experienced those moments where you felt like your prayers were upon deaf ears? Where God said no, or simply wasn't listening, or maybe even felt like God didn't even care? One of the times that your path before you felt so uncertain that you didn't even know what that next step would be to take. I think we all can relate to some part of that story. Whether it is a journey that is before us, that is hard for us to understand, to know which way to go, to take the next step, or whether it is just a time where we felt like our prayers have gone unanswered. And that maybe we need to take things into our own hands. Maybe it's time for us to just push on through and make a way, even though God is saying it will happen. Just be patient and wait. One of the times we've made mistakes and we've hurt other people around us because we didn't trust in God's faithfulness. I think one of the big problems for us is that in our world today, there's just so much noise, right? There is so much that is going on, and we're bombarded with sounds and messages and information, and it just becomes this overload for us. and it's hard to hear God's voice. I've been reading a lot this week from my book, A Rhythm of Prayer. It's a collection of meditations by Sarah Bessey. And she asked different people to write and to share their reflections. And this poem that I found is by Amina Brown. And she's answering this question that a girl asks her: how do you know when you are hearing from God? I think that's a question that we all have. How do you know when you're hearing from God? How do you know when it is God's voice? And so she writes, I try to explain how God is pleading with us to trust, to love, to listen, that God's voice is melody and bass lines and whisper and thunder and grace. Sometimes when I pray, I think of her, how the voice of God was lingering in her very question. How so many of us, just like her, just like me, just like you, are still searching, still questioning, still doubting. I know I don't have all the answers. I know I never will. That sometimes the best thing that we can do is put our hands in the middle of our chest and feel the rhythm there. Turn down the noise in our minds, in our lives, and whisper, God, whatever you want to say, I'm here. I'm listening. It's so hard for us to be able to hear God's voice, let alone know that it is God's voice speaking to us. I think about Abraham, who is Abram at the time, and he's out looking up at the stars and at the night around him, and that is when God speaks to him. But I've been reflecting on Abram looking up at the sky and the stars. Have you ever just gone out into the country on a quiet, dark night and just look up at the stars? To grasp the beauty, the awe of it all that surrounds us, even when we don't realize it or take the time to notice. And it's in those moments, those quiet moments, where I have found God's voice. It's a type of grounding for me. Putting my feet upon the ground, maybe barefoot even, and just centering myself in the creation that God has made, in the beauty of God's creation that is all around me, and breathing in that air, that breath that comes from God, and remembering that as God has taken care of all of creation around us, God will take care of me. But then I get caught up in the noise of life. I get caught up in the news, and I get caught up in the fear and the anxiety of being a parent who sends their kids to school in an age where you don't know if they're going to come home. And I get caught up in the anger of people who are frustrated and tired and weary. And I get caught up in all of the noise that I have to find moments to ground myself, to look up at the stars, and to remember that God speaks, that God loves me, that God cares, and that God is listening and answering prayers, even when I feel like God is not listening. You see, there's something that is healing and so beneficial for our spirits to be outside in nature, to find ourselves alone with our Creator and with all of creation, and to remember that, yes, God is at work, God is speaking, and God loves us. Just like Abram, who had to go out into the night sky and looked up at all of those stars, we too need to find moments of quiet reflection, of quiet spaces where we can sit and we can remember the God who loves us, the God who walks with us, the God who calls us. And even if we don't know where we're going, we can be faithful in taking that next right step. I think for all of us, that is something that we have to do in this season of noise and of people who are angry and the fighting that happens and the othering that is going on. We have to find those quiet places and remember that even though we don't know where we're going, we just have to take that next right step, that next step into love, that next step into God's grace, that next step of peace, trusting that God is leading us into that land that He has promised us. So my friends, I encourage you to find some space this week. Find some space to ground yourself. That when the noise of the world just gets too much, or the weight of it all just feels too heavy, or your own prayers feel like they're being unanswered and you don't know which way to go, to take a moment to find yourself a space out in nature, to watch the leaves fall, to watch the birds sing, to watch the squirrels gather up their harvest and bury it for the winter. And remember that as God takes care of them, how much more God loves you and will take care of you. Take a moment to go outside at night and to look up at the stars and to remember God who is faithful, not only to Abraham and Sarah and to the generations that have come after, but a God who is faithful to us as well.